In the final years before the collapse began to reveal itself, the cities of the modern world glittered brighter than at any other moment in human history. Towers of mirrored glass rose above crowded streets where luxury cars moved silently beside exhausted workers rushing toward jobs that no longer guaranteed survival. Markets reached historic highs. Billionaires launched rockets into space, while millions struggled to pay rent beneath those same skies. The system appeared invincible. News broadcasts celebrated innovation, growth, and unprecedented prosperity. But beneath the spectacle of abundance, something far older was returning, a fracture that civilizations throughout history had never survived for long. The collapse did not begin with riots or burning buildings. It began quietly, inside households forced to choose between food and electricity, inside hospitals filled beyond capacity, inside the growing silence between the powerful and everyone else. And almost no one understood what was coming next. For decades, wealth had concentrated upward with extraordinary speed. Entire industries became controlled by smaller and smaller groups of corporations whose influence extended beyond economics into politics, media, and even public perception itself. In financial districts illuminated throughout the night, fortunes expanded through algorithms, speculation, and digital markets detached from physical reality. Meanwhile, far from those towers, ordinary routines began to decay. Teachers worked multiple jobs. Families delayed medical treatments they could no longer afford. Young adults inherited debts instead of stability. Yet daily life continued with strange normality. Cafes remained full. Advertisements promised happiness through consumption. The illusion of permanence became one of the system's greatest defenses. By the time the warning signs became visible to the majority, generations had already adapted to instability so gradually that hardship no longer felt temporary, it felt natural. The imbalance was not entirely new. Throughout history, empires approaching collapse often displayed the same contradiction. Unimaginable luxury concentrated among elites, while the foundations beneath society weakened quietly. In ancient Rome, senators hosted extravagant feasts, while grain shortages spread through the provinces. In pre-revolutionary France, aristocrats expanded their palaces as peasants starved through brutal winters. But the modern version unfolded on a global scale, connected by technology powerful enough to broadcast inequality into every home simultaneously. Social media transformed wealth into permanent spectacle. Private islands, designer lifestyles, and endless displays of excess became daily entertainment for populations sinking deeper into financial anxiety. Resentment accumulated invisibly, not always through open anger, but through exhaustion, distrust, and emotional detachment from institutions that increasingly appeared designed to protect only those already protected. At first, governments attempted to stabilize the growing tension through temporary measures. Stimulus programs, emergency subsidies, and central bank interventions delayed the visible consequences of structural imbalance. Financial systems became dependent on constant injections of artificial support. Debt expanded to levels once considered unimaginable. Entire economies survived through borrowed time, yet beneath the statistics presented during official briefings, deeper cracks widened. Housing became unattainable in major cities. Birth rates collapsed as younger generations abandoned hopes for long-term security. Mental health crises spread across populations isolated by economic pressure and digital dependency. The collapse did not arrive as a single disaster descending from above. It emerged through millions of private struggles occurring simultaneously behind apartment doors, inside overcrowded trains, beneath fluorescent office lights, where people worked harder each year for diminishing returns. Then came the shocks that accelerated everything already unfolding beneath the surface. Pandemics disrupted global supply chains with astonishing speed. Wars destabilized energy markets and exposed the fragility of international cooperation. Climate disasters intensified migration pressures and devastated agricultural regions that entire populations depended upon. Each crisis revealed systems operating with almost no resilience left. Supermarkets remained stocked only through continuous global synchronization. Hospitals functioned only while staff endured unbearable exhaustion. Financial markets survived largely because confidence had not yet completely evaporated. But confidence itself became increasingly unstable. People began sensing that institutions no longer possessed control over events. The language of leaders shifted from certainty to reassurance, and reassurance slowly transformed into improvisation. but no one understood how dangerous that transition truly was, until trust itself started collapsing alongside the economy. Inside wealthy districts, life initially appeared insulated from the worsening instability. Luxury restaurants remained full, exclusive neighborhoods expanded behind surveillance gates and private security systems. Technology allowed elites to separate themselves physically and psychologically from deteriorating public conditions. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that inequality creates pressures capable of crossing every barrier eventually. Even the privileged became dependent on unstable systems surrounding them. Electrical grids failed more frequently, transportation networks suffered interruptions, cyber attacks targeted financial institutions, supply shortages reached products once considered permanently available. Slowly, fear replaced confidence among the upper classes as well. Investments shifted towards survival strategies rather than expansion. Wealthy individuals purchased remote properties, private bunkers, and citizenships in multiple countries. These were not merely luxury purchases anymore. They were signs that segments of the elite had begun preparing for scenarios they no longer trusted governments to prevent. Meanwhile, public frustration transformed into something more dangerous than protest. It became fragmentation. Citizens no longer shared common realities. Information ecosystems divided populations into isolated camps consuming entirely different versions of events. Facts themselves became negotiable. Conspiracy theories flourished not only because people were irrational, but because institutional credibility had deteriorated so severely that many no longer trusted official explanations at all. Political polarization intensified until compromise appeared impossible. Elections increasingly resembled existential conflicts rather than democratic processes. Families stopped speaking over ideological divisions. Neighbors viewed one another with suspicion. The social fabric that allowed societies to endure hardship together began unraveling under relentless pressure. And as unity disappeared, every new crisis became harder to manage, because populations no longer believed sacrifices would be shared equally across society. Economic indicators eventually confirmed what ordinary people had already felt for years. Productivity slowed, consumer debt exploded, inflation eroded purchasing power while wages stagnated beneath rising living costs. Entire generations discovered that traditional promises, education, hard work, home ownership, retirement, no longer guaranteed stability. This realization carried consequences far beyond economics. Civilizations rely not only on material systems but on collective belief in the future. Once populations lose faith that tomorrow will improve through lawful participation, societies begin drifting toward unpredictable outcomes. Some withdraw completely, others radicalize. Crime rises not solely from greed but from hopelessness. Informal economies expand. Corruption becomes normalized because trust and fairness disappears. The collapse did not begin with society becoming violent. It began with society becoming emotionally exhausted beyond its capacity to care. As tensions escalated, governments increasingly relied on surveillance and control mechanisms to maintain order. Advanced monitoring technologies tracked financial transactions, communications, and public movement at unprecedented levels. Officially, these systems existed to protect stability and national security, but critics warned they reflected a deeper fear within institutions themselves. Fear that populations no longer viewed existing structures as legitimate. Demonstrations erupted across multiple countries over inequality, inflation, housing shortages, and declining living standards. Some remained peaceful. Others descended into chaos after confrontations with authorities intensified public anger. Images of burning vehicles and armored police spread globally within minutes. Yet the most revealing aspect was not the violence itself. It was how familiar such scenes had become. Crisis no longer shocked the public. Instability became part of ordinary life, woven into the rhythm of daily existence. Behind closed doors, decision-makers faced impossible choices. Raising interest rates risked triggering recession and unemployment. Keeping rates low fueled inflation, and asset bubbles benefiting primarily the wealthy. Expanding welfare programs increased debt burdens, already spiraling beyond control. Cutting public spending threatened social unrest. Every solution created new vulnerabilities elsewhere. This was the defining feature of systems approaching collapse. Complexity had grown so immense, that interventions produced unintended consequences faster than institutions could respond. Leaders continued promising recovery because admitting structural failure could accelerate panic. But internally, many governments understood that the era of predictable growth sustaining modern stability for decades was ending. Resources were tightening, public patience was evaporating, international cooperation weakened as nations prioritized survival over partnership. And beneath every policy discussion remained an unspoken reality. The existing model could no longer satisfy the expectations it had created. The human consequences became increasingly visible in everyday environments. Homeless encampments expanded beside luxury developments. Food banks operated continuously in cities surrounded by unimaginable wealth. Teachers, nurses, and essential workers abandoned professions once considered pillars of society because survival itself became unsustainable. Loneliness spread through populations connected digitally, yet fragmented emotionally. Drug addiction and suicide rates climbed across regions experiencing prolonged economic stress. Entire communities lost faith not only in institutions, but in one another. Fear changed social behavior subtly at first. People avoided strangers more often. Public spaces felt colder, less trusting. Parents worried about futures they no longer understood how to prepare their children for. And still, entertainment industries continued broadcasting endless distractions, offering temporary escape from a reality becoming harder to ignore with each passing year. History shows that collapse rarely arrives with dramatic finality. More often, it unfolds through normalization. Populations adapt incrementally to worsening conditions until what once seemed intolerable becomes ordinary. In failing empires, citizens continue working, shopping, celebrating birthdays, and planning vacations even while the structures supporting civilization weaken beneath them. Modern society followed the same pattern. Markets recovered temporarily after crashes, creating illusions that crises had passed. Governments announced reforms, corporations promoted optimistic narratives about innovation and resilience, but beneath every recovery remained deeper instability than before. Wealth concentration intensified, environmental pressures worsened, public trust continued declining. Each temporary stabilization required larger interventions to sustain diminishing returns. The machine still functioned, but with increasing strain, increasing noise, increasing fragility. And somewhere beneath the surface, countless people sensed that the future described to them no longer existed. The breaking point differed across regions, but the pattern remained hauntingly consistent. Infrastructure failures triggered shortages, financial collapses erased savings overnight, political extremism surged as populations searched desperately for certainty and blame. In some places, democratic institutions eroded gradually under emergency powers and authoritarian responses to unrest. In others, governments simply lost operational capacity entirely. Supply chains fractured under geopolitical conflict and climate disruption. Food insecurity spread even within wealthy nations. Insurance systems collapsed in disaster-prone regions abandoned by private markets. Migration pressures intensified global tensions as millions fled economic devastation and environmental decline simultaneously. The collapse did not resemble fiction's sudden apocalypse. It resembled prolonged disintegration, a slow unraveling where every institution became slightly weaker each year, until entire societies realized stability itself had become the illusion. Yet perhaps the most unsettling aspect was how familiar these patterns appeared to historians. Again and again, civilizations expanded wealth upward while weakening collective resilience below. Again and again, elites underestimated the dangers of inequality, because prosperity at the top obscured decay beneath the surface. Again and again, societies believed technological advancement or military power could exempt them from historical cycles that destroyed previous empires. But collapse has never depended solely on economics. It emerges when populations stop believing the system serves a shared future. Once trust collapses, laws weaken, institutions fracture, and survival becomes increasingly individual, rather than collective. The warning signs were visible long before the final crises emerged. But human societies often struggle to recognize gradual catastrophe, because adaptation disguises deterioration until reversal becomes almost impossible. Long after the most severe crises passed, historians would continue debating when the collapse truly began. Some pointed toward financial deregulation decades earlier. Others blamed technological monopolies, political corruption, environmental negligence, or globalized systems optimized for profit without resilience. But survivors remembered something simpler. They remembered the feeling that ordinary life had become increasingly difficult, while public narratives insisted everything was improving. They remembered exhaustion becoming universal. They remembered watching extraordinary wealth accumulate beside visible suffering, until the contradiction itself felt surreal. And they remembered how the collapse did not announce itself through a single historic moment. It arrived through countless small realizations spreading silently across society. The realization that institutions could no longer protect stability, that the future promised for generations had quietly disappeared, and that by the time most people fully understood what was happening, it was already too late.